Welcome back to Contemporary Business, and I'm your host, Ivor Blumenthal. And today I'm so pleased to be joined by a friend of mine, John Endres, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the South African Institute of Race Relations. And John, it's an absolute privilege having you on board. And thank you and welcome to Contemporary Business.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Ivor.
So let's start with the Institute. What I used to, in my student days, do some work with the Institute in terms of tuition and that kind of thing. But what is the South African Institute of Race Relations, or rather, what has it become post 1994?
Yeah, that's a really good question, or a really good addition to the question. So the Institute is South Africa's oldest policy think tank. It was established in 1929, which means 20 years roughly before apartheid was even introduced, to study the relationship between the different races of South Africa. And it was motivated from that time by a classical liberal approach that says that you should treat people the same, no matter what race they are. And so there were concerns about the differential treatment of the different races in South Africa at the time. That then continued through the time of apartheid, during which the Institute opposed apartheid very successfully, ultimately. And after apartheid, the Institute then focused on making sure that the spirit of non-racialism and of progress for the people of South Africa would be preserved. And that is its mission today, is to make sure that all South Africans have a better life.
So, John, we are in the midst of a race war, whichever way you look at it in South Africa. It's a benign war at the moment, and hopefully it doesn't become a militant war. But truly, with the discussion around the Expropriation Act, the advent of the Trump, we are in the midst of something that certainly in South Africa, over the short term, and the short term being the last month or so, has really become a black and a white thing here in South Africa. If you look at AfriForum and Solidarity on the one hand, and you look at the ANC and their partners on the other, that is the reality in South Africa. But how would you characterize race relations today in South Africa?
So I would dispute the fact that we're in a race war. And I would say that based on our polling, which we do annually and have been doing for over 2 decades, we can tell you that most South Africans get along quite well across racial lines, and that the levels of racial hostility are far lower than you might be led to think by reading the media or listening to politicians.
That's
So most South
fantastic.
Africans actually get on. Yeah, absolutely. It's a real, in our polling, we see many reasons for hope. We see that South Africans are not at each other's throats trying to drive each other into the sea or anything like that. Most of them want to cooperate, get ahead in their lives, and not motivated by animosity, and really also are driven by very moderate and sensible values. So if you ask people what the two top priorities are that the government should be focusing on, for the past 20 years, the top answer has always been jobs, which is not surprising because you know what the unemployment situation is like here. And then if you go down the list of reasons, of priorities, you'll see that there's two clusters. And the one cluster is related to services, government services. So it's like education, healthcare, housing, transport, water, electricity. So that those basic things. And the other cluster is about crime and security. So most South Africans are motivated, like if they're thinking about voting and about the government and how the country gets run, they say, like, we need jobs, please. And please, can we be safe so that when we walk home from work in the evening, we don't get mugged, we don't get assaulted, and we can keep the stuff that we've earned legitimately and that we own. And we would like the government, please, to make sure that when we switch the light flick, when we flick the light switch, the light comes on. And if we open the tap, water comes out. And the government is failing at even those basic tasks at the moment, which is
So how
causing a
do
lot of
we
unhappiness.
how do we drown out that noise that would want to, in fact, spark the flames of a race war?
So I would say that the risk of a race war is not zero. Like it's on the horizon, it can happen. I don't think we've reached that level of racial polarization, and most South Africans, as I said, are quite moderate. But of course, if the levels of desperation and of agitation become sufficient, then it is possible that we are going to reach that level. And it hinges on one really very simple and critical fact, and that is the question of economic growth. So if we remain a society where the population grows at 1.3% per year and the economy grows at 0.6% per year, which means that people are getting poorer from year to year.
Mm.
If competition for jobs is zero-sum competition, for me to get a job, you have to lose yours. As long as that is the case, the country remains fertile for revolutionary messaging. So we need to get the economy growing in order to avert this risk, plus also, of course, to improve the lives of ordinary South Africans.
Do you have faith in the captains of the ship in terms of getting that economy growing?
Um, That's a really tricky question because we now are in the GNU world. So we've got 10 parties in government trying to figure out where to lead things. So far, we've really seen the ANC stick very much to its guns. It's continued governing the country much as it did when it had a majority. This means that the coalition partners actually lost out on a lot of battles and
Mm.
contestations. So on Bela, that education law reform, the DA lost out. On the Expropriation Act, it lost out. On the NHI, it lost out. On the negotiation around cabinet positions, it lost out. And every single time the DA got steamrolled, basically. And now, most recently, we've had the dispute over the increase in the VAT rate by 2 percentage points, where the DA said, like, we're not going along with this. We're not supporting it. And that is the first time we think that the true uh, balance of electoral forces is being reflected in the way that cabinet negotiations happen. So the DA is pointing out to the ANC and saying, you've got 40%. Like, you can't pass a budget. You need a majority. You need our votes or you need somebody else's votes, but we're not giving you the votes to increase taxes in an environment where the economy is growing at 0.6% and people are struggling. And yeah, so now we'll have to see how that plays out because this is a really big story now.
I question whether the country is stronger for having the DA in the GNU as opposed to remaining the official opposition in the country. I don't personally think it is a stronger situation to be in the GNU for the DA. We do not, in my opinion, have any effective opposition at this moment in time.
Well, I think much of the opposition has moved outside of parliament. And so if you look at the whole AfriForum engagement, for example, with the United States, that is typically something that an opposition party would have done. Now it's a civil society organization doing this. Similarly, in the area of policy development and the ideas space, organizations like mine are now playing the role that traditionally the political opposition would have played. So the opposition is there. It's just not where you expect it to be. It's outside of parliament now. I think there's some sort of second order benefits to the DA of being in the GNU. And think about it this way. The situation before 29th of May 2024 was that the ANC was in the majority. And a lot of voters had two big concerns. A lot of ANC supporters, ANC voters had two big concerns. Their first concern was that if the ANC dropped below 50% and lost its majority and lost power, it was going to launch a war to hold on to power. There would be mayhem and chaos in the streets. People would be shooting at each other. There would be blood running down the streets. People were very scared of that happening. The second worry was that if the ANC lost its majority and the DA found some way back into power, it was going to introduce racist policies and sort of re-racialize South Africa, lead it back towards apartheid. People were worried about that. But now, post May 29th, we see the ANC has lost the majority, but there's no chaos. Like, the country carries on as before. There's not a problem. It's actually fine. And the DA being in government hasn't introduced apartheid. It hasn't gone back to racist policies. It's been perfectly sensible, a normal party. And so the result of this is that the many disgruntled ANC voters who previously were not willing to consider voting for anybody else, firstly now say, well, I guess it's okay if I don't vote for the ANC, even if they're below 50. There's no chaos. It's okay. And many of them will also say, well, like the ANC and the DA are working together. The DA is not like this white supremacist, racist party that we were worried about, that we were told to be worried about by the ANC and by the
Mm.
media. But they're fine. So maybe I can vote for the DA. So I think it's really recalibrating the entire political system, the way things are like running at the moment.
So coming back to your point, which is that a lot of the policy development and a lot of the traditional work that would be done by an opposition is now being done by civil society and organs of civil society, the South
Mhm.
African Institute of Race Relations being one of those. So, John, one of the reasons I contacted you was this piece that I read that you wrote, in fact, that you presented overseas for the Stichting. And it was really about the Expropriation Act. And something that caught my attention was your discussion about the fact that very few people seem to understand that when one talks about property, which is the subject of expropriation, one's not necessarily talking about land or even land improvements, but property in general.
Mhm.
Explain that, please.
Okay, so I must make a preliminary remark on that, which is that the most important number in South Africa, or the most important economic number, is 15%. And 15% is the rate of gross fixed capital formation, which means as a share of GDP, how much money gets put into factories, into machines, into ports and railways, and all the stuff that you need to make stuff and to ship stuff to customers. So
Are you
that number is
talking,
really,
are you talking here about fiscal allocation?
no, this is both private and public sector investment in
Okay.
fixed assets. And it's about 5 percentage points public and 10 percentage points private. And both of those numbers are too low. So the global average for that number, which in South Africa is 15, is 26. And the target for South Africa's government is 30, which is the target they set for themselves in the National Development Plan. And many emerging economies are above 30, like at 35, 36. Without that, the economy can't grow, jobs can't be created, and we're going to be stuck in the situation that we're in. Why is the number so low? One of the main reasons is that investors are worried about their property. They're worried about their property rights. They think like, if I invest in South Africa, is my factory going to get burnt down? Is my expat manager going to get murdered on the way to work? Is the government going to come up with some new rule that's going to reduce my rights to control my own property? And in this environment of 15% fixed capital formation, the government comes with the Expropriation Act saying any asset in South Africa that belongs to a foreigner or a local person, no matter if it's land or buildings or patents or company shares or pension savings or a coin collection, like anything that can be owned is defined as property. All of these things fall under the purview of the Expropriation Act. Like there's no exception. Secondly, when they expropriate you, you get compensation. Okay, but how much compensation do you get? You might think market value, like if your company shares are worth, 1,000 rand, you get expropriated, you get 1,000 rand. No, it goes on the rule of just and equitable compensation, allowing for deviations below market value. And that is a huge concern because again, imagine this investor in Europe who's got a 50 million euros that he wants to put into South Africa. And he speaks to an advisor in South Africa, says, just take me through the risks. Like, what do I need to know? I've heard about this expropriation act. Is that a risk? And you've got to tell the guy, look, you may think that if you avoid land, your investment is safe because this expropriation act is only about land. You have to tell him, actually, that's not right. Like, no matter what you invest in, it's at risk. If the guy asks you, okay, like, I hope it doesn't happen, but if it happens and I get expropriated, am I at least getting my value back? You have to tell him, well, maybe you won't, maybe you will, maybe you won't. You're going to get something just and equitable, where market value is like one of the factors that goes into it, but also the purpose of the expropriation goes into it, and the history of acquisition and the current use. And you end up with a number that you sort of can't tie to anything. And you also can't contest it if you go to court. Like, what are you going to tell the judge? If you got 50% on the market value and this was declared just and equitable, you go to the judge and say, but I think it's not just and equitable. The judge is going to say, like, on what reason, on what grounds? Like, what's your argument? What, what?
I notice in your frequently asked questions, you're asked that question about whether or not one can depend on the courts, and your answer is not necessarily. Courts
Mm.
may always rule with the state.
Yeah, they often do on matters of ideology. So the courts, they do demonstrate independence when it comes to matters of corruption, for example, or, gross bad behavior by the state. But on matters of ideology, they're pretty much aligned with the state. So anything transformation related, basically the courts uphold what the government wants. And this is transformation related, or it can be at least. This whole expropriation thing.
So in the short term, there's not really a lot that can be done to kick up from 15 to 30%, even though government says they want to be at 30%,
Mm.
because of their very instruments that they're now promulgating, such as the Act itself,
Yeah, exactly. So
or the vagaries in the Act.
yes, and that's our sense is that actually you can get investment up quite fast because South Africa is a type of country that can spark an investment frenzy. Like if you take the brakes off the economy and you remove these obstacles to investment, this is a great place to invest in. It's got so much potential. It's got a big labor force, lots of mineral riches, resources, linkages to global markets, infrastructure, skills, innovation, creative thinking. Like it's a brilliant place. But you've got to take these breaks off, take these obstacles away, and let investors earn money in South Africa. And then you can get the investment rate up. But for that, you've got to get rid of the Expropriation Act. On that, Donald Trump was right. With his executive order, this is a businessman giving business advice. He's saying, you want your economy to grow, you want your people to do well. You can't have an Expropriation Act. That's not going to work. And your race-based policies are also not going to work. Take those things away. be a successful country that we can deal with. Get your economy growing, make your people richer.
But John, we're nowhere close to either of those things happening. The Expropriation Act, which has just been forced through, is very unlikely to even be amended in this regard because there's no
Mm,
compunction on the ruling party to amend that act. And certainly they have the backing of at least 8 of the GNU partners not to have to do something like that. And as far as the 142 odd pieces of legislation with race-based components in them, I can say from a Boosa perspective and from a Nedlac perspective, I don't see that happening in the short term. So,
mm.
what is your message to South African businesses?
So one of my messages to South African businesses is, you're in it for the long term if you're going to be in it. And that's, I think, also a characteristic of an organization like mine with its 90 plus year history. Like we know like stuff takes time. Overthrowing apartheid took, 40 years, 50 years of hard work. Doesn't matter, you still stick with it. And I would also say that in the current environment, I'm detecting a distinct shift in the political balance of power. So I did my PhD work on change management, and one of the most basic models that exist is Levin's model from 1947, where it says if you want to change something, you unfreeze it first, then you go through a move phase, and then you refreeze it in the new configuration, whatever it is. South Africa for 30 years under the ANC was in a solid phase. It's now unfreezing and is beginning to move. And we're going to get into some new configuration, and hopefully that's going to be a more pro-growth and pro-investment configuration. That's what we were working towards. We want this country to grow. We want people to do well here. And politically, the ANC is in real trouble at the moment. It's what it is selling is not what voters are buying.
Mm.
It is beset from all sides. Like the Americans are causing trouble, and there's AfriForum, and there's the health industry suing them over NHI. And there's all the World Bank report on BEE being a barrier to growth. And in the polling, they're down to 32%. And if you take Ramaphosa out the equation, you imagine that he loses a vote of no confidence and is no longer part of the scene. Support for the ANC drops to 20% in the polling.
Mm.
Like this is a party in real trouble. And there's actually only one way to salvage this, and this is to go for growth. Like anything else, like a worsening of the situation, this bad governance that we've been having is going to just drop them further and further, and eventually they're heading for oblivion if they don't change.
So, I want to ask you a final question, and that really is coming back to this issue that property is not just land and improvements. Are you suspicious at all of this move by Parks Tau to create this 100 billion rand fund specifically for the investment in black businesses and the acquisition by individuals of color of businesses out there? Are you suspicious of that fund working in concert with the expropriation bill so that businesses themselves could become the target of the Expropriation Act? The suspicious
Mhm.
person in me seems to draw a link between this kitty of 100 billion rand sitting on the side and the notion of expropriation of non-land-based property, specifically
Mhm.
businesses, as a potential threat to existing businesses, particularly if one factors in definition of just and equitable. Is that just paranoia, or do you think that there might be something to that?
No, I think the risk is real. I just don't think it's linked to the transformation fund. But consider a situation where the fiscus is under pressure. The finance minister is battling to find enough money to cover expenses. And some people will say, look, I guess, we need to borrow more if we can, but that's tough. Or we need to go to the international organizations, the World Bank or IMF, and get a loan. I don't think that's necessary because I think what the government is looking at is the private pools of savings, right? So you've got pension savings of maybe 5, 6 trillion rand in South Africa. All you've got to do is pass a law that says, under prescribed assets, private pension funds have to invest 2% of their assets under management in SANRAL or PRASA or SAA,
Mm.
ESCOM, something like that, which in effect amounts to an expropriation of the savers' money towards a developmental goal at the expense of the savers, because we know, how deficit making these companies are, how big their losses are, how they keep having to be bailed out. So it's going to be bad for savers if their money gets invested in state-owned enterprises. But that could happen.
John, you are such a cheerful chap, and I always enjoy the levity of our discussions. But thank you so much for being on Contemporary Business, and I look forward to doing this again, sir.
Thank you very much, Rifle.
Thank you, John. I really appreciate it.